I'm introducing Wise Young. I'm going to keep this really short so he has as much time to speak as possible. I think we all know that he's a pioneer in spinal cord injury repair, especially with the use of stem cells in combination with other things. One personal comment I want to make about him is that when patients write to him, he always answers, and sometimes you notice his email is tagged as having been sent at 2 in the morning.
Thank you very much. By the way, I found the last talk to be absolutely wonderful, amazing, and I share the anxiety that was expressed about how sustainable public banking is. Now, is it possible for you to turn on my slide? I'm speaking on behalf of Ken Jason. I'm actually a professor at Rutgers University, and I do spinal cord injury research, although since 2003 I've been working a great deal on umbilical cord blood, and we've just completed 5 clinical trials on spinal cord injury in using umbilical cord blood mononuclear cells. We've done a lot of work now taking it into stroke, and I'll describe some of the ways that perhaps one of the ways that I think we can solve this public banking problem that we have, and that is to expand the indications. And so if you can press the right key, yeah. So StemCyte Inc. was formed in 1973 by Robert Chow, and it took several years to actually get its public bank going. Robert, at that time, invented a new processing method, the first new processing method since Pablo Rubinstein published theirs in 1990, that this is using the plasma depleted approach towards preparing the cells for freezing. Next slide. And so the public bank that was established by StemCyte uses plasma depletion. It is the most diverse cord blood bank out there. It is from its outset, attempted to collect blood from Asians, African Americans, Hispanics, to counterbalance the dominance of Caucasian cord blood in cord blood banks. There are StemCyte established international branches. It has working branches in Taiwan, India, and soon in China. And there are discussions of having cord blood banks in Middle East as well, and Africa. It is one of the most accredited banks in the world. It is certified by agencies all around the world. And finally, it has transplanted approximately 2,000 cord blood units over the last 10 years. Next slide. So there's a lot of discussion, and I personally don't think it's a controversy, but there's a lot of discussion between the so-called plasma depleted and the RCR, the red cell reduced units of cord blood banking. Pablo Rubinstein, who was a genius and pioneer in the field, developed the RCR method to save freezer storage space. And so basically the cord blood is placed into a hetastarch or some kind of osmotic solution and spun, and then the red blood cells are removed, and you are left with about 25 milliliters of mostly white blood cells, and that is what is frozen, and that is what is given to patients. Robert Chow said, well, that's an expensive process. Why don't we see if we can simply squeeze the plasma out and store the packed cells? And this turns out to be quite easy to do. It's much cheaper, much faster, and it's more difficult on the thawing side because you have all these red blood cells that tend to coagulate and interfere with the isolation process. But if you are simply infusing the entire cord blood unit, it turns out to be not that much more difficult. You just have to dilute it and also wash it to get the DMSO concentration down from 10% to 1%. 10% DMSO is toxic to blood cells. So there's a slight increase in the difficulty of the thawing procedure, but the results have been very similar. In fact, I would say the StemCyte engraftment rates have been similar or better than the industry standard, and there are over 2,000 units that have been engrafted or have been transplanted. Next slide. Diversity. It's really critical. StemCyte was the first cord blood bank that said we need to collect cord blood from every place. And so very early on in 2003, StemCyte established a cord blood bank in Taiwan and collected nearly a third of its collection is actually from Chinese in Taiwan. And it has now established a successful and very rapidly growing bank in India that is collecting many thousands of units. There's currently moves have been made to establish cord blood banking in China, and this is actually quite a difficult area because the regulations in China is quite difficult and different from anywhere else. But the key thing is that StemCyte now has the most diverse cord blood bank in the world, and I think this is an important thing to do because this is one thing that would increase your market substantially, and that is to collect African, Asian, and Hispanic blood. Next slide. International. Most of the cord blood banks are either bound by country or bound by area. And I think it's important for cord blood banks now to think internationally and establish banks overseas, because one of the problems that I saw was the inability to address new markets, because one of the problems I think the New York Blood Bank and other blood banks in the United States are facing, public banks are facing, is that all the markets are located in the United States and in North America. And although there are Caucasians elsewhere, 80% of the cord blood banks in the United States are Caucasian blood, and they don't match as well as with Asian blood or Indian blood or Hispanic blood or African blood. Next slide. Accreditation, not only do you have to get accreditation in the United States, but if you're international, you need to get it overseas as well. Next slide. Experience is really critical. One of the scary things about the private banking industry is that so few of their units are ever transplanted, and therefore the actual test of that their units have high quality has not been done. And a study done by Joanne Kurtzberg at Duke University opened our eyes recently when she basically said that 50% of the units that she gave, autologous units she gave to babies for CP, did not meet public banking standards. Next slide. So now StemCyte in 2006 established what Chris Hillier just talked about, and that is it created a hybrid banking model. It established a private bank. Now, I think a lot of when it did that in 2006, a lot of people rolled their eyeballs, but I think that it has been a very, very successful experiment, and one that other companies should consider. And that is, why not? If you have a public bank, it's very easy to establish a private bank. The opposite is not true. It's hard when you have a private bank to establish a public bank because you don't have the experience. But if you have a public bank, set up a private bank. It will give you cash. It will sustain you. It will sustain the public bank. And so StemCyte created a private bank. It didn't put a huge amount of money into it like other companies do. When they do this, the advertising costs were low. It targeted specific areas, and in the areas that it targeted, it had dominant market share. And so, next slide. The one selling feature of a private bank being run by a public bank is that you can say you have experience, and it is a great seller. And you can go walk into a hospital and say, look, we transplanted 300 cord blood units this year, and we want to collect more cord blood and the same technology we use for your baby's blood. Next slide. And above all, private banking can provide cash for public banking. And I don't know why, for example, New York Blood Bank isn't doing this. It should be doing this now. Now, I do admit that, people who are in private banking should and may oppose this because it's bad for their business, but they should do it. Yeah.
It's even good for the private.
Right. So next slide. Okay, so I came into this picture in 2003 because Ken Jason, who's the chairman of the board of StemCyte, is a close friend of mine. We worked together at J&J when he headed a company that was doing things for spinal cord injury. And on a handshake, we began to work together very closely. And one of the very first areas I urged StemCyte to address, and Ken really did a fantastic job doing, was to encourage the use of cord blood for indications that it's currently not being used for, but we know it has a very high chance of being successful. And one of these is thalassemia. Thalassemia is the most prevalent genetic disease in the world. In countries like Pakistan, for example, 35% of the population are carriers. In Palestine, nearly 50% are carriers. They say that there are 35 million people in the world who are likely to get thalassemia major, and in India alone, over 100,000 kids are born every year with thalassemia major. And so, but people were uncertain whether it would work. In fact, a study published by Ruggieri in 2010 reported that the cure rate for thalassemia was only 25%, with survival rates of something on the order of 60%. This is terrible. No mother with a baby with thalassemia, even though this baby is getting biweekly transfusions, would submit her baby for a procedure which has a 40% chance of killing her baby and only a 25% chance of curing it. StemCyte funded a study in Taiwan, and this study was done by Herjang in Taiwan. Next slide. And Herjang at the Changkong Memorial Hospital, which is the largest and one of the best hospitals in Taiwan, funded him to treat babies with cord blood, babies who have thalassemia with cord blood. And over a period of 4 years, he achieved a remarkable statistic of 75% cure of the babies treated and over 90% survival of the children. Now, that statistic is overall, he treated patients from 1 year to 14 years. But the most compelling statistic was that in children under 7, his cure rate was 100% and survival rate was 100%. If I were the mother of a thalassemic child, I would now start considering this. Now, he is continuing to do this. StemCyte is funding doctors to take fellowships at this hospital to learn how to do this properly so that they can also achieve these statistics. And recently, StemCyte achieved the first 3 cures of thalassemia in India. And this is a huge, huge market. And one of the ways that you can greatly expand the field is all of a sudden be able to treat millions of patients. Instead of having 10,000 units being transplanted per year in the United States, you've got 100,000 transplants all over the world. And that's how you can expand the indications, and you can get public banks out of trouble by expanding indications. Next slide. As many of you know, I am doing spinal cord injury research. We've completed 5 clinical trials. I don't have time today to tell you all the results, but I just want to tell you that we have now proposed global phase 3 trials to test these results. Our phase 2 trials, which hopefully will be published within the next few months, have suggested that umbilical cord blood cells regenerate the spinal cord and also restore ability of our patients with complete spinal cord injuries to walk. 75% of our patients in a phase 2 trial with 20 patients are now walking with minimal assistance. So this is a dramatic effect, a dramatic result. There are 3 million people around the world with chronic spinal cord injury. This will expand the market very significantly. In addition to spinal cord injury, we have started trials on stroke. Professor John Lin at Taiwan initiated this with autologous CD34 cells transplanted into the brain. These are people with middle cerebral artery stroke, chronic spinal cord injury, more than 6 months to 5 years after injury. Anyway, he found dramatic benefits of the transplants in the spinal cord, but about half of his patients, especially those that are over 50 years old, did not benefit. And so he has now proposed to use mononuclear cells from umbilical cord blood because they're much younger. The hypothesis is that your old cord, your autologous stem cells, like from me, I'm in my 60s, so I'm out of range for good cord stem cells. If you use young cord blood to do this, you should have better results. And so the phase 1 and phase 2 trials are now going on in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. Next slide. Next slide. I've already talked about this. Next slide. Then finally, some of you may know StemCyte has initiated a program to treat AIDS, HIV/AIDS, with umbilical cord blood. And very, very quickly, in 1996, a mutation called CCR5 delta 32 was found to confer resistance against AIDS. And a man by the name of Timothy Brown received a bone marrow stem cell transplant from a CCR5 delta 32 homozygous donor. And he became cured of his AIDS and his leukemia at the same time. And he was regarded in the New England Journal of Medicine to have been cured of his AIDS. StemCyte engaged in a large program where they have now found about 600 umbilical cord blood units in 7 umbilical cord blood banks around the United States of units that are CCR5 delta 32 homozygous. I can tell you that 3 units have been shipped already to places to treat people who have both HIV and leukemia. One child was treated with an umbilical cord blood unit that is CCR5 delta 32 homozygous, and that child, even though that child did not have HIV, had only leukemia, that child is now completely resistant to AIDS. So we are currently using a gene silencing method to shut down the CCR5 gene, and we believe that as soon as this other trial establishes proof of concept that this works with umbilical cord blood, that we'll be able to silence the CCR5 gene before giving it to, particularly to high-risk people who have AIDS. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, finally, I just want to mention 3 areas that StemCyte is also exploring, both at the preclinical level and at the exploratory level at phase 1 level. One is to do age-related macular degeneration therapies with mononuclear cells injected into the retina. This is the most common cause of blindness in the world, and these trials are being done in China. There's a lot of interest in doing ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and finally, there are discussions now to initiate a mononuclear cell therapy of post-myocardial infarct, congestive heart failure. So if any one of these areas hit, we're simply quadrupling the market for public banks. And I think this is going to be the answer. So thank you very much.
Ted Goldberg from Mexico City, Cordon Vital, private bank supporting public banking also. Do you have anything to say regarding the storing tissue also, cord tissue, as an alternative approach?
I think there needs to be a lot more research. A lot more research. I mean, right now, none of these, for example, there's storage of the cord itself, and then the cord lining, and there's, of course, a lot of interest in the placenta itself. There needs to be a lot of research to show that this collection of these cells are actually applicable in human and to set the standards for it. So I'm in favor of the research, but the research is still rather early. And there have been very few clinical trials that have shown benefit of these cells, and therefore to charge patients to collect this is I think, probably not a good idea, in my opinion. On the other hand, cord blood is an established commodity. It saves lives every day. And so I think there's no question that cord blood should be collected, and there needs to be much more research on the other parts of the tissues that would be collected. Of course, there's a lot of interest in collecting adipose tissue as well, as you know. I just want to mention here, probably some of you are rolling your eyeballs saying, well, how can this little company do all this stuff? We now currently have about maybe 10 clinical trials going. A lot of these clinical trials are actually driven, they're investigator-initiated clinical trials that are supported by foundations and charity. And for example, that's what the spinal cord injury clinical trials are being supported by. So StemCyte is looking for partners because there's no way it can develop all these indications. And it is, at its base, a public bank that is seeking wider, broader use of its cells to save lives. And so if there are companies that are interested in partnering with StemCyte in this area, StemCyte would be very, very happy to talk. Thanks.